CNN. As part of our 360 Days Around the World special, we're going to focus on the Latin American country of Guatemala. Tonight with us, we have Mr. Alex May to help with our program.
Hello, I'm glad to be here.
Very nice to have you here. Let's just start with Guatemala then.
Alright, I'll give you a little bit of history. So the Guatemalans won their independence from Spain in 1821. There's some guys who were really ready to go out there and win complete liberty around that time. They had seen the French Revolution over in Europe, and they had read some of the works of those great British philosophers, and they were definitely into the concept of freedom. The established money in the region made it hard for them to really win that battle. The status quo of the country didn't change very much after it gained independence, and the right-wing dictators just started to march in. There wasn't much room for reform. In the 1870s, though, this man named Justo Rufino Barrios came along. He was just a dictator like all the others. The thing that was different about him, though, was that he was a liberal. On the left instead of on the right, like all the other guys. Even though he ruled with an iron fist, he made a lot of reforms that were good for the common people. He started to distribute land among the peasants. That was a really big deal at the time. And he established the base for a public school system in the country. Barrios and his reforms didn't last, especially long in the country. In 1885, he was killed in battle, and the right-wing dictators took right back over. The leftists never had a chance to defend that position after he died. After the conservatives were back in power, a lot of the liberal reforms of Barrios were erased. Guatemala was an unpleasant place to live for a long time after that. It's still an unpleasant place to live, actually. Coming closer to the present day, one of the more significant recent leaders of Guatemala was Jorge Ubico. He was a real strongman right-wing dictator in the 1930s and 40s. He was more liberal than most of his predecessors, just like Barrios. He made the economy nice and stable and made sure to increase health and school facilities. He ruled with an iron fist, though. He wouldn't tolerate any kind of threat to the political or economic order. The U.S. was backing him because of that. He kept the big companies on top, and the biggest company in Guatemala, United Fruit, was from Boston. He was giving that American company a lot of breaks. To those who wished to destroy the status quo that he supported, he warned, "I execute first and give trial afterward." Now that's a strong stance if I've ever seen one. He wasn't taking any crap from the people below him. A funny thing about Ubico, though, he was hopelessly out of touch. He went on tours of the country to see how his subjects were living, but the only subjects he ever visited were rich, landed elite. Because he was so conservative economically, the rich people he visited loved him. He was keeping them rich. He was always greeted with gifts and friendly smiles. After he went on so many of these tours of the country, he began to think that everyone loved him. The problem with that assumption was that the people he visited were part of the 2% of the population of Guatemala that owned 72% of the land. The other 98% mostly resented him. He kept the economic situation the way it was, and the way it was that they were all at the bottom, impoverished, or close to it. He treated them pretty badly besides that, too. He massacred dissenting Indian tribes and routinely had labor leaders and intellectuals killed if they had threatened his authority. Slowly, people began to organize against him. At the center of the movement was mostly teachers, students. It all started with small protests, just popping up here and there around the country. That really shocked Ubico. He was pretty nervous. The protests began to gather steam faster and faster until they reached a breaking point on the 29th of June, 1944. Guatemalans from all walks of life gathered to protest and demand that Ubico leave his post. Ubico was shocked and quite flustered, I think. He made a rash decision and told a division of his cavalry to charge the crowd in an effort to disperse it. 200 of the protesters were killed or injured in the charge. One of the dead, Maria Chinchilla, was one of the leaders of the movement. Her death gave the movement a kind of martyr, and that gave the movement even more momentum than it already had. Ubico had no choice after that. He resigned his office a couple days later and put a general in his place. Ponce was his name, I think. Federico Ponce. He was ousted a short while later in a coup by General Jacopo Arbenz Guzman. We'll be hearing more of him later. Anyways, after Ubico and Ponce were gone, this extremely charismatic man named Arevalo came along. He had been exiled during Ubico's administration because he was progressive. He was the leading candidate for the presidency before he even set foot back in his home country. The day he did come back was one of the most jubilant days in the history of jubilant days in Guatemala. He won the presidential election with an 85% popular vote. The future seemed bright for Guatemala, as the president Arevalo abolished Ubico's hated secret police. He repealed the repressive labor laws. He pushed for higher literacy, higher pay, cooperative farm programs, and higher voter registration. He gave the natives of Guatemala more freedom than they had ever had. The Indios could form labor unions and political parties. He really turned Guatemala into the right direction.
As terrible as Ubico's regime sounds, it appears that Arevalo did what he could to undo some of the damage that was done.
Yeah, that's for the most part true. Thankfully, it was certainly a step in the right direction for the nation.
But what about General Arbez Guzman? He was one of the leaders who forced Ubico out of power.
That's right, and in 1950 he was freely elected as president of Guatemala, openly declaring himself a socialist. At first, this notion was a good one, and he fought to help out the people. One of his first actions as president was to legalize the Guatemalan Communist Party. In order to break away from American economic control of his country, Arbenz built certain establishments to force out U.S. businesses. Hydroelectric plants fought with U.S. dams. Ports and state highways were created to compete with the United Fruits Company. In response to this, the United States cut all economic aid to Guatemala in 1951. A year later, Guzman saw how fertile land there was in their country, and saw that the majority of it was owned by United Fruit and went untouched. He decided that in order to best help his people, he needed to nationalize some of the land. Arbenz planned to seize 400,000 acres out of the total 550,000 acres that the company controlled, but also compensate them accordingly. In order to pay them accurately, Guzman intended to use their tax returns to see how they valued the land. In reality, these records were incorrect because out of sheer greed, United Fruit falsified their claims so that they would be able to pay much, much less to keep their land. They refused to give away the land, but Arbenz took it for the government. This action struck fear into the hearts of Americans because they saw it as an act of communism. They're always seeing acts of communism. At this time, 1952 it is, the Cold War between Russians and the United States was beginning and anti-communist tensions were pretty great. The U.S. government believed in a policy of firmly standing against communism, for any appeasement could lead to a domino effect, where one by one, Latin America would fall to the Iron Curtain. They decided that they had to act quickly, so Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, along with his brother, the head of the CIA, Allen Dulles, planned Operation Success, a covert operation with the intent to oust Arbenz and replace him with a dictator friendly to the U.S. and United Fruit. On June 18, 1954, the CIA enacted Operation Success and replaced the democratically elected Arbenz with Jorge Castillo Armas, a dictator. For the next 40 years, dictators would run the country with a repressive iron fist.
Truly a gruesome history. Thank you very much for your time, Mr. May.
No, thank you, sir. I am always happy to spread Guatemalan awareness.
Now, as a continuation of our focus on Guatemala, I am happy to say that it is time for our human interest story. Continuing with a nice focus, I would like to talk about native Guatemalan Rigoberta Menchú, a Quiche Indian who has recently been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for her work in bringing international attention to the atrocities in Guatemala that she calls genocide. Her work as an activist has been dedicated to shedding light on the true nature of the Guatemalan army during the longest-running Latin American civil war ever. This war lasted from roughly 1960 until 1996, when the United Nations stepped in and made peace between the two parties. Unlike other civil disputes such as those in Nicaragua and El Salvador, this struggle was not due to different ideologies, class conflicts, or wealth differences. Instead, this war was a race war. The Guatemalan army was comprised of either white Europeans or mixed-race people called mestizos, and they fought against the guerrillas, who were almost entirely native people descended from the Mayan race. Following the ousting of President Arbenz by the United States CIA in 1955, Guatemala was run by a series of brutal dictators who gave no thought towards their native people. Police officers could be seen dragging Indians away in trucks so that they would not detract from tourist locations. At the height of this mistreatment, between 1978 and 1984, more than 50,000 Indians were massacred, and more than 40,000 were displaced and put into militaristic model villages. One reporter who visited Guatemala during this time said simply, "Indian life in Guatemala is miserable." Those who survived the massacres and genocide of native Guatemalans are often forced into the lowest parts of society. Entire families had to work on fruit farms, such as those run by the United Fruit Company. They would start from ages as young as 7 and work all day picking fruit and spreading pesticides and insecticides that are illegal in the United States. In her book, Me llamo Rigoberta Menchú y así me nació la conciencia, Rigoberta explains her first-hand experience with this kind of work, and more importantly, its dangers. She lost a friend and a brother to over-intoxication of the fumes that are produced by the cotton production. Menchú also lost another brother to malnutrition due to lack of adequate food. Unfortunately, this was also the case for thousands of nameless Indians over the course of the brutal Civil War, and the government just looked the other way. To them, these people were nothing more than a pair of arms to work the field. They were a backwards, uncultured people who had no hope for living with Europeans. On a large scale, the United Fruit Company sucked the life out of its workers and grew on the backs of the dead Indians. All the while, the governments of both Guatemala and the United States turned their backs, content with the fact that the company was importing cheap fruit and making Guatemala rich. I'm sad to say that even today this attitude continues. While the slaughter has long since ended, the ideas remain. Europeans, or the descendants of Europeans who live in cities and suburban areas, still hold prejudices against these native people because of their radically different cultures. Socially, religiously, and culturally, the dozens of native tribes are virtually a different race from people that live and work in very Western lives. Economically, while the Indians are responsible for a large part of the production of goods, they receive almost none of the benefits for their work. The situation mirrors that of Hispanics in the United States in the 21st century. This forecast, I'm afraid, is much the same for the rest of the country's problems. The median age in Guatemala compares to those in Central African countries. This means that it has one of the lowest life expectancies in the world. The average age of a male is 19 years, and the average age of a female is only 20 years. This is due to continued underreported violence that plagues the country, underdevelopment, drug trafficking and abuse, and widespread disease. The country right now is facing so many problems that their future looks bleak. Many, however, are optimistic that in the future Guatemala will be able to turn their country around and join the world in great success. I, as many others, will now just cross my fingers and hope for the best. This has been Carter Sauls, reporting, BBC NN. Thank you.
It actually wasn't that long.